Hi, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, right? As much as I can from my home office in Brooklyn. So, yes, I'm going to start with a poem right before I dive in. But I picked this poem because I think it has some of the themes of the discussion I'm going to present to you today. So, this poem is called Toolkit. I am from a long line of what they call hysterical women, wild women, stubborn women, difficult women. My abuela belted years of sorrow, strung notes of violence tight into a life's travels like a newly made rosary. My mother spent years of silence only to slice by necessity, refusing to budge like a wild horse never to be tamed. Today, he says my abuela can't be trusted. From one hospital to another, home to home, broken in bones, but never in spirit. Today, my mother laughs to his face, cuts deep into the recesses of historical forgetfulness, reminds that forgetfulness is an action, widens the holes. I slither through them. I am from a long line of emotional women, women unafraid of emotion, women who use emotion to survive. They call them hysterical, wild, stubborn, difficult. I call them poetas. Reaching deep with the contours of their tongues, they taught me more than language. They taught me to scribble and scream, be silent then sassy. These hysterical women are my toolkit. I face the walls of complicity, coercion, constraint. The poem has a sledgehammer. So this is one of the poems from my forthcoming book, Chingona Rules, which is going to be released in August, I believe. And it made me think of some of the women in my book who may have in their times be labeled difficult or different or emotional, and how these kind of these words and these stereotypes affect particularly women of color in the hip hop arts. So, what I want to present to you today is the stories of two Mexican immigrant women living in New York City who have not fit the mold of the typical Mexican woman, right? They are not quiet, they are not shy, they are not humble, at least not when they perform, right? But rather they take on a confident persona on stage. So let me just pull up my screen for you. All right. So the title page, right? So this is a little bit from my book, but focusing particularly on the women of the book. And this is the first, there's an opening quote in my book that I love from, at least for the students, someone that I know that you've read, Gloria Ansaldúa. It says, a woman who writes has power. A woman with power is feared. In the eyes of the world, this makes us dangerous beasts. And I want to think about not just women who write, but women who write and then get on stage and really, bring their writing forth in an oral way, right? So I'm going to start by presenting Xochitl Ramirez, also known as Rapi Ramirez. She's 25, right? And again, she's not this idea of a stereotypical Mexican migrant woman. Dressed in combat pants, white sneakers, and a black hoodie and a black beanie, she is quiet and shy, sitting across from me at Sunset Diner. And I want you to remember, right, that she's quiet and shy when we meet, right? And we meet in Sunset Park, a neighborhood that has become a major center of the Mexican community in Brooklyn. Feminized by long flowing black hair and large silver hoop earrings, she describes how she migrated to New York from Mexico City, alone and pregnant at just 19. Although Mexicans are known for migrating to New York City to work and improve their lives of themselves and their families, such was not the case for Xochitl. As she describes her situation, muchos dicen que vienen por buscar mejor vida. A mí realmente me atrayó no tener lo mismo. Quise ver otras cosas. So she says, a lot of people say they come to look for a better life. But for me, really something else attracted me. I didn't want the same. I wanted to see other things. Not only did she want to see something new, she wanted to see it in New York City. For Xochitl, who dropped out of high school and found herself living at home, unemployed, her migration to New York City was deliberate. No quería otro lugar. Siempre he estado en una ciudad. Entonces dije, me voy para allá. I didn't want another place. I've always been in a city. So I said, I'm going there. In particular, Xochitl, whose rapper stage name is Rappy, was attracted to New York City because of its hip-hop history and her desire to be a part of that tradition. Young, independent, and adventurous, Xochitl represents a new kind of Mexican migrant and Mexican state of mind that is increasingly finding their home in New York City. So let me just tell you a little bit about my book. And first, I want to start by kind of dissecting a quote from one of the other MCs in the book, actually the first MC I ever met, Raul Hernandez, who says, when I first came here in 1990, we moved to the Bronx and there were no Mexicans. I had a lot of problems there and my father was like, you're not going to survive. Then we moved to Queens and it was a little better. Colombians, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans. It was easier in some ways because you could communicate, but it was basically the same shit. And I just point this out because over and over again, when I was interviewing, Mexicans who migrated to New York City, who had been here for some time, right? So Raul kind of reflects an earlier migration and someone who came here as a child. What they talk about is how few Mexicans there were, how few support systems they had, how marginalized and targeted they were. Often they were the targets of being beat up, right, or seen as a vulnerable population. And so if any of you are from New York City, you know that a lot of that has changed, right? You can get a good taco in New York City now, right? And you don't have to know a secret spot. It's all over the place, right? And so there's been a visible increase of Mexicans in New York, but they still have a lot of invisibility. So, for example, Carlos Menchaca of Sunset Park is the first Mexican American council member in New York. So that goes to show you kind of like the lack of political power, the lack of social capital. So again, a little bit about the book. A Mexican State of Mind is Rappy and other young Mexican migrants. A Mexican State of Mind is about Rappy and other Mexican migrants' creative lives in New York City after September 11th, 2001. And in addition to introducing Mexican cultural productions outside the traditional Southwest U.S.-Mexico border or California context, this book marks a period when Mexicans start to become a significant population in New York City. Between 1990 and 2011, for example, the Mexican population increased 443%, from around 62,000 to 335,000. I'm sorry, I'm terrible at saying words. 335,000, according to the New York City Department of City Planning, to the third largest immigrant group, following Dominicans and Chinese. Due to the large undercount of undocumented Mexican migrants, however, these estimates range to over 600,000. Significantly, this has made New York City one of the top 15 cities in the concentrations of Mexicans in the U.S. So now, when we think about Mexican cities in the U.S., right, we think about Los Angeles, we think of El Paso, we should really be thinking about New York as well. At the same time, the aftermath of 9/11, in terms of anti-immigrant sentiment and increased security and surveillance of bodies of color, specifically shaped the experiences of the young men and women in this study who find themselves to be increasingly racialized and criminalized over the past 18 years. Nevertheless, rather than investigating anti-immigrant policies or only looking at traditional forms of labor insertion, this book takes the backdrop of illegality and labor in order to emphasize other aspects of their New York City experience, specifically artistic, innovative, and imaginative ways Mexican migrants fill their lives. More than hobbies, music and art represent the ways in which Mexicans in New York City articulate their sense of culture, fulfill their need for creative expression, and protest a status quo built on daily migrant marginalization, based on real or perceived documentation status and racialized systems of employment and criminal justice. In addition, by highlighting creativity over employment, the arts over immigration status, this book sheds light on the ways Mexicans, especially undocumented migrants, are not often seen as creative people. While academic studies and mainstream media alike emphasize issues relating to border crossing and illegal employment, my questions revolve around artistic inspiration and creative work, which may or may not also become a form of employment. This is especially significant in a New York City Mexican context. Even though Mexicans are seen as the representative, problematic racialized immigrant in both current and longstanding climate of anti-immigrant sentiment, they are often seen as out of place in New York City. Despite its status as the multicultural capital of the world and the historic immigrant gateway via Ellis Island in New York, Mexicans are seen as insignificant newcomers, if at all. However, at over 600,000, Mexicans are in fact quickly closing in on New York's other Latinx populations, which stand over 700,000 apiece, and that's referring to the Puerto Rican and Dominican populations. Upon arrival, so this is just a little picture of celebrating the Mexican win in the World Cup. Upon arrival, Mexicans concentrate in Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx, where they face harsh housing and work conditions. Mexican immigrant households are more likely to experience overcrowding and to spend more than half their income on rent than those of any other immigrant group or native-born population. As Kirk Semple of the New York Times described one building in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, a dozen of the building's 16 apartments are occupied by Mexicans, and most of those have 2 families per unit, sometimes more. Except for a few women caring for small children, all of the adults, about 50, are employed. Most work long hours, 6 days a week, for minimum wage or less. Some have 2 jobs. The building is a microcosm of Mexican industriousness in New York City, and there are hundreds of others like it, bastions of low-wage work, crowding, and hope. Right? And what really always struck me about this quote is that word industriousness, right? Often thought of, something, positive, like immigrant industriousness. But what it's really talking about is, incredible low-wage oppression, right? And when, some of these, the research talks about minimum wage or less, right? More often than not, it's less, right? Mexicans have to be industrious in New York City because they also have among the lowest household incomes and education rates due to the large number of new immigrants, many of whom arrive as teenagers or as young adults and so did not or do not complete high school. Because of higher birth rates, and despite the fact that migration to the New York City metropolitan region was composed mainly of adults, Mexicans represent the youngest population of any of the major Latinx nationalities, with an average age of 25. Yet despite their formal educational limitations, these conditions also foster a Mexican youth culture that is multicultural and transnationally tech-savvy. As such, despite the challenges Mexican migrants and their children face, New York City is home to an increasingly diverse young Mexican population that is largely male, so it's 60% male, and yearning for creative outlets to add meaning and create community beyond their often limited work options. But it's becoming more female. So I think even, that that data may be outdated at this point. The population is changing so quickly. And so more and more women are migrating as well. Still, in an era where all migrants face limited work options, Mexicans are adept at finding and keeping work. Of the city's 10 largest immigrant groups, they have the highest rate of employment and are more likely to hold a job than New York's native-born population. They're even employed at a greater rate than Mexicans nationwide, which, again, is incredible, right? So although some may take this is a sign of Mexican industriousness, it also points to the marginalized status and desperation of their situations. And Audrey Funk, who I'm going to talk about later, she describes, pues, puedo decir que horrible, de terror y de explotación trabajando sin papeles, las cosas cambian mucho. Ser una mujer de casa trabajadora, morena, inmigrante, no son los puntos más favorables. La explotación y el cansancio han sido, al menos por el último año, un constante en mi vida. La verdad es que el sueño americano dista mucho de ser un sueño. Al contrario, lo encuentro bien de pesadilla. So in this quote, she really talks about like the experience, not just of being, of working class exploitation or, below working class exploitation, but like the experience of a woman of color, right? And how it like morally, it tires your soul even, right? And she talks about how, the American dream, for her, is not an American dream, but a nightmare. And she is specifically someone who's talking about work in restaurants where a lot of migrants work. So it's more than just working hard. It is a life of fear and knowledge of your own exploitation, right? These people know that they're being exploited, right? And that just adds to the terror and kind of and tiredness of the population. So now just back to Rappy. So she's there in the middle with her crew, Buen Dia, Brooklyn. So here, single mother, Mexican mother and hip hop MC Xochitl Ramirez Lopez represents another trend of Mexican migration. Mexicans were the only major Latinx nationality experiencing declining median household incomes and inflation-adjusted dollars from 1990. In large part, this was due to the increase in lower-paid female household heads. Rappy is a female household head, right? Which increased from 25% of all Mexican households in 1990 to 38% in 2010. That's a tremendous increase. Owing to these factors, poverty rates actually rose for all Mexicans from 19% in 1990 to 28% in 2010. So Mexican women in particular are struggling, right, to survive and provide for their families. Nevertheless, music as a creative outlet is not just a practice Xochitl carried across the border, but also what she prioritizes in her New York City life. So a little bit more about Rappy. Rappy is a member of Buen Dia, Brooklyn, a hip-hop arts collective based in Sunset Park with transnational ties to a Mexican hip-hop crew called Inc. From Mexico City, and even international connections to MCs in Japan. In her artistic work, she has created a localized form of Mexicanidad through a Spanish language lyricism that explores the experiences of Mexican migrant women living in Sunset Park, as well as a larger Mexican hip-hop culture through Buen Dia's affiliation with Inc., a hip-hop crew based in Mexico City. She is often the only woman performer at events, and she is the only female MC of Buen Dia, Brooklyn. And she describes her experience in New York's Spanish language hip hop scene as one often being the only woman. As such, she walks a fine line between her belief that la mujer aporta mucho en el género de hip hop, the woman adds a lot to, the hip hop genre, and the realization that nunca van a estar tan aceptadas por los hombres, that women are never going to be as accepted as men. So again, here is she's in the middle. If I could point, but I can't point on Zoom. She's in the middle there. This is an event of Buen Dia Brooklyn in Brooklyn at a location called Hard Life Inc., which is another arts collective. And then here is some of the crew. And again, you can see it's not shocking, right? She wasn't able to attend this event. She has, responsibilities as a mother, and it's all men, right? This is not weird in this type of setting. So again, goes back to what she says, right? We give a lot to hip hop, but we're not as accepted. And I think it speaks volumes that she says that even though she's part of a crew, that put out one of her EP, and I'm going to drop the link to her EP in the chat, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of a taste of her performance. And I want you to go back to those words that I said, right, about her being shy and quiet when we met, and then her performance of hip hop. So let me just get out of here. Oh, I guess I can't. Anyway, so I guess I don't have chat. But you look up Rappy in SoundCloud, and you can find her EP, which was released in August 2007. And again, now I'm going to just play a little clip of her during a performance. Let's make this bigger.
Calles de la zona, aquí las adicciones suelen ser las que controlan, nos dominan la pereza, la avaricia y nunca falta el envidioso que se asoma. Todos son terrenales que acoronan, quieren tomar el mando y proclamarse la reina de la colonia. El respeto nos domina, la experiencia y los billetes en la bolsa. Aquí sirven los tuyos, las armas, fantasmas, campañas, para lograr a la loca. Lugar que quiera que el que se menciona ser tu compa, se le tiende la mano solo a aquel que reconoce su derrota. No se confía de nadie, que muy confidente tuyo se controla. Así es como en esta área las cosas funcionan. Aquí los errores tocan y se perdonan. Así es como la ley es más fuerte y controla. Y solo con corte se silencia la boca. Hay el cemento, asfalto, concreto. Aquí debilidad.
Oh, hold on. I found the chat. Let me drop this link in here. Okay, so you can look up her music, and she has sent 7 songs from her EP that she released in 2007. And she talks about in her music speaking out, speaking up, just like finding your voice, surviving, living with intention, overcoming life's challenges, writing as a weapon, literally refers to writing as a weapon, not caring about opinions of others and being yourself. But it's not like an overtly like women are marginalized music. And I've always wondered, although, and maybe this is something I can follow up with her at some point, how much of her body of work, her performance, and her production is influenced by the fact that everyone she works with is men, right? And what that must, be like, right? So, and the reason why I wonder that is because the second rapper that I want to present, going back to my presentation now, is Audrey Funk. And Audrey Funk makes it a point to work with men as little as possible, right? Not that she doesn't work with men, right? She's actually married to another rapper, and he forms part of her group as a kind of backup, which, again, she's like at the forefront and he's at the backup. But she is always collaborating with other women artists. And that's really important to her. So Audrey Funk is a rapper from Puebla, Mexico, now residing in the Bronx. And unlike Rappy, she migrated, I don't know exactly the age, but she at an older age, she was not still, a teenager, right? And she had quite a career in Mexico as a rapper prior to migration. She has a BA in philosophy, and as I said, even though she migrated with an established career, she's spoken, as I gave you that quote earlier, about her struggles in New York City in low-wage service sector jobs. And she's frequently forming part of feminist collectives across Latin America. That's kind of some key notes about her. So a feminist rapper and social activist with significant musical stature and career, she moved to New York in 2017 after falling in love with a Mexican-American MC from the Bronx, whom she met during a previous visit for a performance. However, New York City is not hospitable to her. As she has described, her experience has been one of economic precarity, trying to balance her music career, which often takes her to Latin America, with temporal restaurant work and even performing on the subway for money. Significantly, Audrey's major conflict in the film is dealing with her nostalgia for Mexico and rebuilding her ego and pride as a woman, as an immigrant, and an artist who is not welcome in New York. According to Audrey Funk, The most valuable lesson of this time of my life is dealing with my ego. I left behind a lot in Mexico, but I'm going to build a lot of things in the US. For Audrey Funk, the place of women in hip hop is not so much just because of hip hop's kind of misogyny and patriarchy, but she sees it as connected to the larger position of women in the world, and especially women. She specifically is concerned about women, Mexican women, and their position, and women in Latin America. So she says, "Lo más difícil de ser mujer, pues es creo lo mismo que en cualquier ámbito de la sociedad, que te tomen en serio, que no te vean a menos y que respeten tu poder. No es la música, es el mundo mismo." So it's not the music, right? It's the world that women. So as a result, she tries to change society with her music. So she has a very particular and cultivated message and performance that she's developed over the years. So let me switch out here. I want to drop in and share. So I'm going to share 2 little clips of videos, I think, if I can manage. Audrey Funk has, as I said, like a long career. She has music out there for like 10 years. So there's a lot of material to work with, but this is one from a month ago.
Es Audrey Funk, desde México y el Bronx, para todos los cuerpos posibles, para todas mis mujeres. Siéntete chida, escucha esto. Listen. Estas carnes de mujer pesada, nunca más que flow, en eso estoy sobrada. Sin complejos ni ataduras, muevo lo poco que tengo de cintura. Me bajo lentamente, sube la temperatura, ¿me entendiste? A mí me valen verga tus estereotipos de blanquita europea. Estamos decolonizando tus ideas. No lo hago para ti, lo hago para que todas puedan. Sin complejos, no te avergüences. Todo eso es tuyo, muévelo, te pertenece. Sin complejos, no te avergüences. Muévelo, eso es tuyo, te pertenece. Liberar la mente para liberar el cuerpo. Con todas mis girls vengo a cortar tu ego. Mi manada elijo primero. Jamás tu opinión, esa está de más culero. Aquí vine a recordarte cada mañana como mantra. Dale que dale.
Okay, so that's one. And then to share, this one is from 5 years ago. And you can see kind of like the trajectory, right? Called Rompiendo Esquemas.
Hey, tú. Sí, tú, ¿te gustaría hacer rap? Pues déjame decirte que no puedes. ¿Y sabes por qué? Porque eres mujer y tu lugar está en la cocina.
Desde niña fui rompiendo el esquema de la vida, partiéndome la madre en cada menester que impida discutirme en laberintos que decían sin salida. Cuando veo a mi madre, el orgullo se destila por los poros, y algunos me decían que solo podía hacer los coros. Como flor marchita, sentía mi crecimiento sin poder notar que me sobraba el aliento. Y estoy aquí después de 24 años demostrando que las de mi calaña siempre nos rifamos y no nos vamos. A la vida frente a frente siempre la topamos. Porque fui destinada a ser una guerrera. En el jaguar está la fiera de piel canela. Cuando el beat suena, represento México hasta Sudamérica. Oye, llego volando como un cóndor. Mi corazón como copivo y florece y al servicio del rap me pongo. Ay no, yo no respondo si tu falta de calidad humana te hace tocar fondo. Recorriendo el sur del continente el Keisen puso los bombos. A todo el movimiento no lo vamos a parar, rompiendo los esquemas desde tu ciudad hasta Chile sopla el viento, el mensaje va que te dice unidad, tu ciudad. Hasta Chile soplamiento el mensaje va, que te dice unidad, fuerza y rap. Esta unión no es como el hielo, está forjada.
Again, you can find these on YouTube, so you know you can. She has many wonderful videos. So right, so Te Pertenece, right, you know, is really about, you know, body positivity and really like reflects her trajectory in the last, you know, like 3-5 years where she's like her videos are mostly showing women, right? There's not a lot of men in her videos. The earlier video, right, there's men in the videos, but it's talking about the place of women in hip hop. Like I love this one line where she says something about how, you know, like they told her she could only sing choruses, right? She's like, no, hell no, I can, you know, do whatever I want, you know. And then she has another song that I also recommend called Sin Retroceder, which is about femicide in Mexico, right? Which is a big problem, right? So Mexican hip hop in New York, just to kind of zoom out a little bit, is slowly becoming a space in which women take part, both individually and as part of these collectives, in the case of Rapi of Buendia, and in female-led efforts. MC Audrey Funk, in particular, is taking a leadership role for Mexican women in New York City by advocating for female-centered and led hip-hop activities. Much of this comes from her background in collective feminism in Latin America within a hip-hop context. By collective feminism, I mean a demand for gender equality that is founded and directed by women with the intention of creating a group of women who work individually and have individual beliefs, but also come together for collaborative action. For example, in 2009, Funk helped to found Mujeres Trabajando, Women at Work, a group of Mexican hip-hop artists dedicated to music that promotes positive messages about women. 8 years later, Audrey Funk continues to be a member of the group, formed by women who practice everything from breakdance, graffiti, visual arts, photography, and other media forms in addition to rapping. As Funk explains, this type of project is important not just to promote women in hip hop, but to support them in their personal lives as wives, mothers, daughters, border crossers, so that they can continue to be hip hoppers as well. With members now from all over Mexico, from Puebla to Juarez, they continue to put on shows while expanding into other areas, such as a clothing line called Funky Beast. As such, Mujeres Trabajando makes an important statement about valuing the labor of women in hip hop, but also helping to support all the other labor women must often shoulder due to gender roles and expectations, so that continuing to do hip hop is possible, right? So, like, can we create childcare so a mother can go out and do hip hop, right? You know, all these kinds of larger thinking about what, you know, the kind of impediments to hip hop. Audrey Funk is one of the best known female MCs from Mexico, having performed in national and international venues such as Chile, Bolivia, El Salvador, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, New York, and I think a year or two ago, I watched her go all over Europe. So really, you know, growing into an international presence. Her personal musical style is a unique mix of hip hop with reggae, soul, and funk, over which she raps in her powerful and deep vocals that explore the nuances of life as a Mexican woman, with themes from love to discrimination to defying expectations. One of these that she's really big on is about standards of Mexican female beauty, according to Funk. And this was really that first video that I showed is what it's about. And she has some lyrics that mirror this quote. I really want to dignify the beauty of women. Here in Mexico on television, you can only see blonde girls and skinny girls. In Mexico, we are not all blonde and we are not all skinny. So why do the systems want to make you feel bad about your size, your color of the skin, the color of your eyes? Like me, I'm not a skinny girl. I'm a big mama. So I always say I'm a big sexy mama, and why do I have to feel bad about that? And this is also clear in her song Máscaras, her contribution to an album Latino America Unida, which is a collaboration of female MCs from all across Latin America, another album I highly recommend you pick up if you're at all interested. It's just excellent, and they have a song that they do all together, which each MC has a different chorus, and then there's like 12 tracks with different MCs from all across Latin America. And again, in this song, she defies listeners' expectations of her. Unlike many of her videos in which bright clothes and city backdrops encourage movement and positive energy, Mascaras has a sobering, edgy, and anti-discrimination message. Shot in black and white, the video features a stripped-down Audrey Funk in a hoodie and dark, thick eyeliner. In it, she powerfully describes the cages of societal views that limit women. And while domestic violence is one aspect of this cage, gender violence runs much deeper, with roots that extend and oppress in many ways. For this reason, in her bars on the final track, she both encourages female strength and unity, as well as pointing out systems of gender oppression. So she says, y nos juntamos todas las guerreras, which again, she used in the song Rompiendo Esquemas. She referred to her as a guerrera, right, a warrior. Disolvemos fronteras, quisieron separarnos, acusarnos de hechiceras, conseguir en el olvido a las que dan vida a la esfera. Guerreras, as a, again, that word is an important way of conceptualizing this form of feminism. Not only are female warriors a recognizable symbol of women's power, it is one that does not diminish women's importance as the gender that also literally carries and gives life to the future. It is one that reaffirms women's place as mothers while also questioning gender roles that diminish women as weak followers rather than as strong leaders. For this reason, it should come as no surprise that Funk is a member of multiple hip-hop collectives. So from Mujeres Trabajando, she's expanded, such as Somos Mujeres, Somos Hip Hop, which produced that album, that Latin American women album I mentioned. And these types of collectives see one woman's success as essential to advancing the cause of all femcees. She's also a member of Somos Guerreras, We Are Warriors, led by Guatemalan MC Lane, Rebecca Lane, and they went on a tour all throughout Central America, I think in 2019. In addition to concerts, the objective behind the tour is to shoot a documentary about women in hip-hop, as well as give workshops that help facilitate female networks among a new and younger generation of women. Despite her frequent travels today, Audrey Funk is settled in the Bronx, an experience which she said has fundamentally changed her. Hay un Audrey antes y después de NYC. So there's an Audrey Funk before and after New York City. The Bronx is significant for Funk, not just because it is where hip-hop was born, but because it was hip-hop that changed her life. Her New York City experience is one which she has both described as terrorizing due to the realities of being a migrant woman of color, but also a space of hip-hop diversity she has never experienced before. Although the Mexican hip-hop scene in New York City may still be young, according to Funk, el hip-hop in NYC es diverso como la ciudad misma. Puedes encontrar más de 10 flows en un evento y todos son agradables, de diferentes países, de mezclas, de colores distintos. Es una experiencia bien diversa. So again, talking about the New York City diversity of hip-hop, where you can find 10 different types of flows from 10 different countries, right, all at one concert. And while in many ways, Audrey Funk has had to start over in New York in terms of her status as an MC, it is this opportunity to reach an increasingly diverse audience that drives her. Funk says, creo que cada escenario que piso es un logro más. Cada medio que se interesa, cada persona que confía, esos son los mayores logros y espero que cada día más personas confíen en este proyecto que tiene mucho corazón. So, every time she gets on stage, it's another step forward, right? And, it's an opportunity for her to meet more people who, are interested in her work. So just by way of a couple conclusions, right? So I feel like Audrey Funk and Ramirez represent two different ways of navigating Mexican hip hop community in NYC. One which is kind of forming part of the largely more established male-led Mexican hip hop community, right? And one that is kind of like, let me let me do my own thing. Let me forge my own path, right? And that for Audrey Funk goes beyond even collaborations in hip hop. So she collaborates with other women musicians across genres. Someone like Renee Gauss, who I'm not sure if she's in New York City. It's hard to know where people are in the pandemic right now because they drop in on Zoom. But who was in New York City and they met and started collaborating. And she's a guitarist, right? Both challenge traditional, the kind of role of traditional, Mexican women's role in society and women's roles, both in terms of the larger society and in the hip hop genre itself, right? And both recognizing that kind of through hip hop is a means, right? Through hip hop, they can address the larger societal issues, right? And it's also a way for Mexican migrant women to find and express their voices in a society that often silences them or sees them just as mothers or right, to quote former President Trump, right, anchor babies, right? They see Mexican women or Latina women as women who come here and just have babies, right, to have U.S. citizens, right? And so they want to, they perform a very different type of identity than that which is being placed on them. And I think New York City also is a specific and interesting site for these Mexican migrant women to explore these identities because of both the invisibility and visibility of the Mexican population, as well as that diverse community that they're able to come in contact with. A large Afro-Caribbean population. Again, to go back to Audrey Funk's commentary, right? 10 different flows from 10 different countries in one concert, right? Where else can you get that? So I want to end with Audrey Funk's optimistic words, right? I think this is the last slide, which is that even though there is a lack of female MCs, femcs in Mexican hip hop in New York, and that this is both cultural and situational, that this is changing, right? She says, creo que sí, es bien cultural. Creo que las mujeres de muchas partes del mundo, no solo de México, no han roto cadenas. Sin embargo, no soy pesimista. So she says, yes, I think it's cultural. That a lot of women in a lot of the world, not just Mexico, have not broken the chains. But I'm not a pessimist. Cada día veo más mujeres en proceso de desprogramación y de cuestionamiento. Creo que solo es cuestión de tiempo para que más compas empiecen a levantar sus voces. So every day I see more women in the process of deprogramming and questioning. I think it's just a matter of time before more compañeras, right, more women start to lift their voices. And so with that, I look forward to your questions.
So much, Melissa. And I want to open the questions for people. Please raise your hand or put your question in chat, and Melissa will do her best to speak to any of your questions or concerns. So again, raise your hand or put your question in chat, and we will field questions from you. Melissa, it always takes people a minute to kind of let things set in, and could you? I know that you don't just know Audrey, but you've written with her, and so could you talk just a little bit about the experience of writing with Audrey and not just having her as a subject of fieldwork, but as a co-author and a collaborator?
Yeah, this is like a phase of the work that I'm really excited about. Moving from, so I mean, it really builds on the way I saw the book process, or how the book process developed, right? So I describe in the preface or in the introduction about how I came to see, the people in the book. I don't like to refer to them as subjects. I like to refer to them as collaborators. They're people I had conversations with that I learned from, and so it's my privilege to have been able to write and share their music, their art, their philosophies, right? Especially about music and hip hop and the arts, with an audience. And so building on that, I asked, Audrey Funk, who even without knowing that she has a BA in philosophy, right, strikes me as a philosopher from her music, right? And from her work as a, as a, as an activist, as a, in all these collectives, right? All these feminist-led collectives, right? She definitely exudes the philosophy. So we worked together on an article or on a book chapter for a book kind of about decolonizing, educational spaces through Chicana, studies. And so what we specifically worked on was decolonizing, an educational space through a kind of decolonial, feminist, Latin American based hip hop philosophy, right? So thinking about issues of, colorism and underrepresentation of, indigenous, people, and that kind of what she talks about in terms of perception of beauty in Mexico that, valorize a kind of European blonde, skinny look and don't incorporate people like her who are mixed, or who come from indigenous backgrounds, right? And then also adding that feminist bent that she, has, which is, how can we work together as women to occupy more space, right? To occupy more space in hip hop and thus in classrooms, right? How can we use hip hop in the classroom, especially hip hop that is, female centered, feminist, right? And she speaks about her experience at performing at Harvard, right? Which is like, the Ivy League of the Ivy Leagues, right? I mean, well, you guys I'm speaking to an Ivy League, right? And kind of how both alienating that was, but also how students, Latino students, were really able to come and connect with her, and how that served as a powerful experience for the students. So it's both like philosophy and experiential based writing, and it was just so much fun to write with her. She wrote in Spanish, I wrote in English, then we put it together in English, and definitely I could see doing more of those types of projects.
So we have a couple of questions, and the first one is one that you could talk about for 3 years. So it's going to be a challenge. If you could talk about other cultural or literary productions in New York City created and written by Mexican and Mexican American subjects.
Oh, it's so interesting. I think there's really like a growing Mexican art scene, and it's at different levels. So there is the more working class scene, which is what I focused on, which is especially young. I mean, it's like not that old in terms of years, but also it's run by young people, right? So I think like the pioneers are 35, right? So maybe that's old for college students, but it's not very old to me. And so that there's various crews and art collectives that are kind of based around hip hop arts. By that I mean graffiti and breakdance, DJing, MCing, music production, increasingly like fashion as well. So that's kind of one whole scene. New York City has always been a place that has attracted writers, right? So you have more more elite, or people who have access to more elite spaces, or had access to more elite spaces, have been traveling through New York City for a long time. Valeria Lucelli has a fascinating, book where one of her characters is a Mexican, living in Harlem in the 1920s, right? And if you look back at the archives, there were Mexicans, not a lot, but it was like the artists and activists and literary types that were in in New York. They were the ones who were there, right? What shifted is, now there's a larger population, and it's more working class. Mano a Mano, which I'll type in the chat, is a wonderful organization that promotes. They even have like a whole kind of like artist lineup where, like, if you're interested in having a Mexican, artist, dancer, for an event or something, right, you can contract them through them. So that they're kind of like a representative, but they're also a community organization. And they, for years, put on a Mexican workshop, a literary workshop, where they produced several anthologies of Mexican New Yorker writing. And so you can find that both on their website, and I think on Amazon, you can find that poetry and creative writing there. And then the last thing I want to mention is about 12 years ago, Lehman CUNY, right, founded the Mexican Studies Institute, which is housed at Lehman. It's actually, when I'm at my office, it's downstairs from me. And they have put together an oral history project where they are documenting all this kind of artistic work that Mexicans are doing. It's on BronxNet and also on YouTube. And so that's another great place to kind of look at like the diversity. But again, there's kind of these different scenes. A lot of it has to do with class. A lot of it has to do with access to spaces and who is allowed into the academy. And I think, places like the CUNY Mexican Institute are actually trying to break down those distinctions, right? And so they've brought in both people like Carlos Menchaca, right, who's not necessarily from an elite background, but has made it to the hollowed walls of council government, as well as people who are more building photography studios and mic rooms, recording studios in small bathrooms, right, in order to produce their music. So there's a lot of diversity.
Melissa, I'm going to invite Honey Crawford to unmute herself, because Honey personally, and I know you would like to say hi to her and give her a shout out. And she's going to ask her question live.
First of all, I didn't know we could unmute ourselves. That's amazing. Hi, Melissa. Yeah. Thank you so much for this beautiful talk, Melissa. I was saying in my question, first of all, that I think this book feels really necessary, and it also feels beautifully conceived. So thank you. I'm excited to read it. And my question was about, I loved the quote that you left us with from Audrey. And she used the word deprogramming, like she sees more and more the deprogrammization of women. And I wonder if you might think or riff a little bit on the genre of hip hop and how it lends itself to deprogramming social, specifically in women, what we see in mainstream hip hop right now for Afro Latina. Sexual deprogramming, certainly, but also social deprogramming in relationship to motherhood, even. As you brought up, there's the resistance to motherhood, but there's also the, when we see, Cardi B on Saturday Night Live, fully pregnant and fully sexual, how that's deprogramming as well. But I wonder if you might speak specifically to the experiences of Mexican American women in hip hop and how this genre affords deprogramming or sort of welcomes those artists who are on sort of a lifelong mission of deprogramming the self. And thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I love it. So I think for some Mexican women, especially those like Rappy or Audrey, who migrate by themselves, although Audrey like migrated for a relationship, so it's a little different, right? New York City like offers an opportunity to kind of escape certain strictures that they had in Mexico. And so like I think of Rappy's story where like she felt like oppressed by her family, lack of opportunities as well, but also kind of by the role she was expected to play in her family and didn't want to play that role. And so, she decided to move to New York. So New York is a kind of space where it affords other models for Mexican women. And so I think that's powerful. I also think of like Audrey Funk has this video that I briefly mentioned. Actually, it's not a video, it's just a track where she talks about femicide in Mexico and how she uses like the words of men who blame women for the violence that's inflicted on them, right, because of how they dressed or how they where they were, right? And so I think, right, hip hop, right, as a genre, because it does what's the word? And this is going to kill me later. It takes from other music, right?
Yeah, so it's samples.
It's samples. Thank you. That's the word. Samples, right? So it's sampling from things, right? So it's a lot like, so when you sample from, for example, patriarchal language, right? This is a way to like comment on that and kind of highlight, right, like the way that the patriarchy is in the language itself, right? And so I think that's a way, right, to again go back to that idea of like deprogram like women to listen for what is literally in the language, right? So like hip hop as a genre, like I don't know about you, but like when I'm into a song or when I have to, when I'm first listening to a song, I have to listen to it several times to listen over and over again, right? To get the lyrics, and to understand fully the message. And so, same like a poem, right? So like poetry, right? But you're listening, so it's a different experience. It allows you to be like it like gets that muscle where you're like, now you're listening to language more carefully, So I think that that's powerful, for women and part of the project.
You're making me think about how, so like when people talk about punk rock, for example, and the DIY aesthetic of punk rock in terms of technique and the level of skill that a guitarist needs to have in order to just assert themselves into the scene. You're making me think that we need to think about that more so in hip hop, the DIY-ness of itself, of the genre, and how it's that do-it-yourselfness is founded in something really literary, like sampling language, sampling words, sampling beats, and like you said, obsessing and reading over and going back and really addressing it as a poetic in the listener as well as the creator in hip hop, and how DIY, doing it yourself, might be interpreted as deprogramming, like or self-construction at least.
Right. but then there's also this whole other aspect of performance, right? Like, and so, I mean, I literally, I've been with these women off stage and on stage. They're completely different, right? And so, but I think for like someone like Audrey Funk, the performer and the activist over the years have gotten closer and closer, right? So like that act of performing constantly, that like strong, feminine, comfortable with her body, sexual, proud of her sexuality, like that has become right part of her identity. And so Audrey Funk and Audrey Bustos Diaz, right, her legal or name,
Yeah.
government name, um, are closer. I think have come closer over the years, and there's less of a performance. So how does like just that act of performing also right change the performer? And I think that's part of what they do, like in the collective women's work, is kind of you know train young women on all these aspects, including performance, right? So that's also an important aspect to it. And I also think just one other note is like this aspect of training and having women be part of all aspects of hip hop production, not just like the performer, not just right. So now like moving from backup dancer to performer, right?
Yeah.
That's not enough that to be the beat producer and the editor and the videographer, right? So I think that's really become important as well.
That's great.
Melissa, thanks, honey. It's so great to hear your voice. Melissa, we have a couple more questions. I'm going to group them together. They're both from students in my class, but Bill is standing by and can unmute people if they have any follow-ups that they want to make. But, because of time, I'm just going to group the two together and read them out to you. Gerardo Aguilar says, I'm from Brooklyn, and I get frustrated not being able to see representation in Mexican, Chicano work and history in Brooklyn. Being that we do have support systems in place for us today and people like us who have based their careers here, how can a space be made that reaches a public front so that we can reach the mainstream? Or at least, why haven't we been able to reach the mainstream? So hold Gerardo's question in mind. And I'm also going to give you Priya's. And Priya says, considering the mass gentrification that occurs in New York City, how do you think tensions between immigrant communities, native quote unquote New Yorkers, and the wealthy and often white millennials has impacted the arts in areas that were historically brown and black or lower income? So the two questions kind of go together, but they're addressing slightly different aspects.
These are fantastic and difficult questions, so I'll do my best. I mean, the lack of of kind of Mexican social, political, artistic capital in New York. I mean, I think there's a couple reasons for it. One is the relative newness of the population, right? So it was like 2010 and everyone was like, oh my God, there's a lot of Mexicans. And then, right, there started to be kind of studies and attention, but there's still not a lot like academically, politically, about the Mexican population. So there was that kind of large increase. And again, also a lot of the population being young and undocumented, is another, reason. And then, I don't know how to say this. There's a resistance, and this kind of goes into the next question. There's a resistance, from some to kind of see New York as a Mexican city, right? It's always been like a Caribbean city, right? It's, Puerto Rican and Dominican. And those very important, populations, it's kind of like some like in council or in the arts or whatever, they're like, well, we have a Puerto Rican, why do we need a Mexican too, right? Like there's this kind of unintentional by the community, right? Competition for scarce resources for Latinos in a city that is 1 in 3 Latino. Like it's ridiculous. There should not be scarcity of resources for Latino populations, and that's something that's really affected the CUNY Mexican Institute, which receives very little funding from the city, proportionally, right? In comparison to the Puerto Rican Institute or the Dominican Institute. And not that I want the Puerto Rican or Dominican Institute to get less funding. I think they need more funding than they have, right? But it's very stark, and the numbers are public, right? And so it's kind of been this like, where do Mexicans fit, issue. Carlos, there is and then there's the whole like Mexican versus Mexican American versus Mexican migrants. So I think the Museo del Barrio actually hired a Mexican at one point to run in Museo del Barrio, but he was like from Mexico City and super elite and had no ties to the community in New York City whatsoever. Like, and so there's this kind of lack of understanding of the nuances, right, of the Latino community. The same thing with like that I read every day about Latino politics, right? Why are Latinos voting Republican, right? Like instead of looking at what are the nuances of, well, why are younger Latinos gearing more progressive? How are things different and shaped by location and class and migration experience, right? This lack of nuance to the diversity of the Latino population. There's a similar lack of nuance in New York City. And again, that's become, to kind of veer into the second question, that's become a struggle in terms of where do Mexicans physically fit, right, in New York City? Where do they go? So in terms of gentrification, it's interesting. There's been a little bit of work on the relationships between like the Mexican population and the Puerto Rican population, right? Which is one of the original Latino and Native, right, as U.S. citizens populations. And what's interesting about those studies, so two kind of takeaways from the studies. One, right, when Mexicans first came here, a lot of them report being like physically terrorized, attacked, beaten up for being Mexican, right? And that being, and that again, right, that will take away from anyone kind of, raising of visible, right? People used to hide that they were Mexican if they could, right? But on the other hand, it's on a study done on East Harlem, Spanish Harlem, which is the center of the Puerto Rican community in New York, right? They tend to look on Mexicans moving in as somewhat favorable because that means they're not being gentrified by white people, right? So, there definitely are a lot of divisions, but kind of, it's still in progress. So the only real progress I've seen for the Mexican population in New York City in terms of the arts, going again back to the first question, is when Mexicans do it themselves, right? That no one is handing out money to Mexicans. So like Mano a Mano is a community, nonprofit organization. The collectives that I write about in my work, Buen Dia Brooklyn, which you can look up, or it's Hard Life Inc. I'll write them in. Sorry. Can't think and type at the same time. Hard Life Inc., right, those are, you know, artists banding together and, you know, seeing both that they want to be in community, but also that financial benefits. Like together, we can rent an apartment that we can turn into a studio, right? We can, you know, kind of mutual aid, you know, opportunities. Um, but I think there's still kind of an overwhelming view of like New York City is not a Mexican city, right? Mexicans have California, Mexicans have Los Angeles or El Paso, right? Not that there isn't, you know, large marginalization and racial injustice there for Mexicans, but right, that's their territory. And so Mexicans are still seen as kind of encroaching here.